Thanks for inviting us in. This is the Delphi Debrief here on WTHR+. Day 11 of the Delphi murders trial was a shocking one. A psychologist today testified about suspect Richard Allen confessing to killing Libby German and Abby Williams. In a moment, our legal expert, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, will be in studio with me to break down what this means for the case. But first, let's get you right out to Delphi with senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel and Emily Longnecker. They were in court today. Bob and Emily?
Scott, 2 days in a row now, we have heard testimony that's been all about Richard Allen's jailhouse confessions. Yesterday, we heard from 8 different prison staff members. They all testified about hearing confessions in one form or another. Those were pretty general confessions that we heard about. Today, by far, the testimony we heard today, the most damaging so far for Richard Allen out of all the testimony that we've heard over the last couple of weeks. And the testimony today, it came from the psychologist who saw Richard Allen just about every day that he was at Westville Correctional Facility for more than a year.
Right, and very specific. She had very specific testimony about the kind of confessions he made. Yesterday, you know, the defense referred to generalized confessions that he made to these prison guards. Today, very specific wording.
Let's get you up to speed on the witnesses that we heard testimony from today. The first witness, the one that we've been referring to, Dr. Monica Walla, she was on the stand for more than 5 hours, and she's the prison psychologist who met with Allen throughout late 2022 and 2023 while he was at Westville. We also heard from Steve Mullen. It was his 3rd time taking the witness stand during this trial. He was the Delphi police chief at the time of the murders, and he's now the lead investigator for the Carroll County Prosecutor's Office. And then we heard from Brad Weber. He is a local Delphi resident who owns property very close to the murder scene. Really surprising testimony, or the way that we heard testimony from him today. We'll talk about that in a little bit. First, let's talk about Dr. Walla. She was the state's star witness today. She was on the stand for more than 5 hours testifying about her daily meetings with Richard Allen, serving in the role as his psychologist. She told jurors that last April, Allen told her during a one-on-one meeting, "I killed Abby and Libby, I'm sorry." But it was a month later, during another meeting, that Wallace says Allen not only confessed, but he gave details of the murders. Walla read from her clinical notes today, telling the jury what Allen told her. And she said, Allen went to his parents' house in the morning, bought a 6-pack of beer on the way home and drank 3 of those beers, and then bundled up and went out to the trails. That's where he saw Abby and Libby, and he followed them across the bridge. She said Allen told her that he did something with his gun at that point, which he thought might explain how a cartridge from the gun ended up at the crime scene. And she said Allen told her that he instructed Abby and Libby to go down the hill. The psychologist told the jury that Allen then said he planned on sexually assaulting Abby and Libby, but he saw a van and got scared, so he told the girls to cross the creek. And Wallace said that the defendant told her that that's where, in her words, cut their necks. That's what she said that Richard Allen told her, cut their necks, and made sure that they were dead, and then covered their bodies with branches and returned to his car, staying off the trail so that he would not be seen. So Wallace said that that was one of multiple confessions that she heard from Richard Allen during his time at Westville, and that, again, there were multiple confessions. And it's interesting to point out that you might think that your conversations with a doctor or a psychologist would be private, and the defense team tried to exclude Dr. Walla's comments and her testimony from the trial.
Right.
The judge ruled that she could talk about her interactions, despite the fact that she was serving as his doctor, because of a very specific Indiana law that when it comes to confessions or murders, that type of testimony is allowed.
Yeah, and she talked about writing those down with a pen on taking notes, and then actually going back each day and entering them into a system, and then she would shred her notes. And the defense really attacked that, the fact that she shred her notes and thought that that was not best practices. And she said that she did that, for security reasons and privacy reasons.
And it was interesting that when Dr. Walla was reading from her notes today, that evidence, that exhibit, was actually passed out to all the jurors so they could follow along in her notes as she was testifying. And one of those clinical notes that she read from actually was another confession involving a phone call that Richard Allen made to his wife while he was in prison. And Dr. Walla said that Richard Allen requested that she actually stay with him so that she could hear him call his wife Kathy. And I want to just share with you what she recalled from that. She said that he asked his wife if family loved him and would always love him. He had talked about the fact that he might have to live the rest of his life in prison. He mentioned the electric chair, and he stated, "I killed Abby and Libby," at which point she said that she could hear Kathy Allen, Richard's wife, saying, "Stop saying that." And then he said, "I didn't do everything that I said, but I did kill Abby and Libby."
Right.
So again, the jury got to hear what is really, I mean, once the jury hears those types of things, that's not something that you can unhear.
They cannot unhear it.
Yeah, I mean, very, very specific details that he provided. And again, this was multiple conversations that he had that Dr. Walla overheard.
And the state has been saying that, that they would eventually, that he had provided details that only the killer would know. And I think that we heard some of those details today, right?
Yeah, we did, and it's interesting, though, because in the interrogations with Richard Allen, we saw those videotapes earlier in the week, there were multiple details, obviously, details, some of which have come out in the media, but there were also details that I think investigators shared with him saying, look, we have this information, we have this information from the crime scene. So it is still a little bit of a question mark about how many of the details that Richard Allen shared on that phone call at that point in time would be only details that the killer would know that weren't already shared with him.
And the defense made a point of talking about when he would receive the amount of discovery that he had received, the discovery information about the case, the probable cause, all of these details, and how thick that discovery file was, and then that they met with him. And it seemed to me, anyway, that they were kind of alluding that he might have had, specific details about the crime because he had all of this discovery evidence to go through and look at.
That's a great point.
Is that how you took it?
Yes.
Because that's how I took it.
And that he got very agitated and that his mental state declined
After that.
After he got this huge amount of discovery material. So we would assume that a lot of that discovery material might also have some details.
Right.
Do want to talk about his state of mind because that was a really big focus of today's testimony from Dr. Walla, trying to better understand, was Richard Allen, was he psychotic? Was he out of his mind at the time that he made these confessions, or was he not? And for me, it was very confusing because during, as the state was asking Dr. Walla to read through her notes, they would ask her to focus on very specific sections that made him seem that he was in his right mind, that he was perfectly fine, versus the state pointing out,
The defense
the defense pointing out and asking her to read from portions of her clinical notes over 13 months where he was not.
Right.
Okay.
Where he had many concerns about the conditions that he was living in.
And let me give some examples of that. So when the state asked Dr. Walla, they pointed out certain parts in her notes. And she said that Richard Allen's confession was one of them, the main one that we told you about, where he gave a lot of details. She said it was concise and in chronological manner. At the time, his anxiety and depression seemed improved. At times, she said he does not present as psychotic. She said at certain points it seemed like he was faking mental health problems, that he was remorseful, wanted to share his Bible with Abby and Libby's families and apologize to them. And at other times, she talked about things that he did that just then contradicted the fact that he was in a good state of mind when he made these confessions. She said that at times, right around the time that he made the confessions, he was eating his own feces, rolling on the ground naked, banging his head on his cell so hard that he had 2 black eyes,
Right.
and they had to give him medication for psychosis against his will. They were so concerned about his mental state. And when they asked him why he ate his feces, he responded, because he was sane and didn't have water. And then when Dr. Walla told him that that didn't make sense,
He said,
his response was,
I know.
I know. So what to make of that? That's part of the testimony. And then when the state asked Dr. Walla to refer to very specific parts of her notes, Walla acknowledged that she had diagnosed him with a serious mental illness,
Right.
that he was a fragile man, she
Right.
said, that while he was in Westville prison, that he had an abrupt occurrence of psychotic behavior around the time of his confessions. She testified that she has thought more about the idea. She said that it seemed perhaps he was faking his mental illness, but since then, she's thought more about that.
And thought perhaps she was wrong on that,
Yes.
that he was not faking it.
Yes. So was he sane? Was he mentally ill? Now it's for the jury to decide. And at least for me, sitting in the courtroom today, I'm not sure where I come down on
No.
that, and that might be confusing for the jury as well.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
And we learned about the conditions too
Yes.
that he was living in. I mean, when the defense was asking her to read her, I think it was called the suicide notes, the notes that she took while he was on suicide watch, right?
Yes.
You know, she noted, and the defense had her note about, you know, that he was fighting ants and cockroaches for his food. Again, you talked about the 2 black eyes that he had been, you know, banging his head, that other prisoners he had told her were calling him baby killer and telling him
Yes.
to kill himself. Therapy in a 3x3 area kind of behind a cage. That's how the therapy was. And there was kind of a debate of whether he was shackled during that or whether they had taken his shackles off during that therapy. And he told her, the defense, you know, talked about this, that he told her that he felt like he was being already treated like he was guilty, and at one point said that he didn't do this and would never be okay being in prison for something he didn't do.
And they pointed out again, he was under video surveillance 24/7. The whole time he was there, because he was under suicide watch. He was in a special cell where they could watch him, even when he was going to the bathroom. They talked about the fact that he couldn't fully turn the lights off in his cell at any point. They just talked about that, and the defense has been working the last couple of days and talking with the prison officials to try and establish for the jury that the conditions under which Richard Allen was living at Westville Correctional Facility would drive anybody crazy.
Right.
It seems to be the way that they're going and what they want the jury to believe.
And they also talked about the physical changes. They had Dr. Walla talk about the physical changes that she noted in Richard Allen, that at one point his eyes seemed to be bugging out of his head.
Bulging out of his head.
That's right.
Yes.
Bulging out of his head was one of the things that I took note of. And of course, you said the 2 black eyes from self-harm, that he was self-harming.
Yes. So, Scott, it was a fascinating day of testimony from Dr. Walla today, and again, I think it's going to leave a lot of questions for the jury, just as far as after hearing these really compelling confessions from a psychologist who testified that she heard these things and lots of details from Richard Allen. What's the jury going to actually make of whether or not he was mentally capable at the time? So that's really one of the big things that came out of the session today in court.
All right, Bob and Emily, we'll get back to you shortly. Want to bring in Katie Jackson-Lindsay. She's our 13 News legal analyst during this case, joins us in studio. Based on what Bob and Emily were discussing about Dr. Walla, the prison psychologist, and her testifying about these alleged confessions, what do you make of all that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right? There's first the confessions in and of themselves. Are they credible confessions? Are these sort of coerced confessions, not in the normal sense, where we normally see a person being interrogated so aggressively that they are coerced to say things that aren't true. But on the other hand, while he's not being interrogated, he is living in this squalor and these really, really challenging conditions. And so there's that just immediate thought of, what is a jury to do with this, right? It's really hard as a defense attorney to have your client ever confessing to a crime. How can you convince a jury that your client didn't do something that he said that he did? But on the other hand, having been a deputy prosecutor, I would find these confessions equally challenging to present as concrete evidence of him confessing to the crime. And so just that part is difficult to unpack. And then to hear the things that we've heard about this particular witness, to hear some things as it relates to her credibility. And we heard Bob talk about how she was inconsistent in some of her conclusions. On the one hand, she's saying that he's not necessarily psychotic, but she's also saying he's being treated for psychosis. She's saying that she doesn't think that he was mentally ill, but she diagnosed him with a mental illness. And now here, live in person at trial, she's saying that she's starting to sort of rethink some of the things that she once thought. So I would agree with Bob. It has to be really challenging for the jury to unpack this and reconcile some of these conflicts. And you don't usually see conflicts in evidence from experts. A conflict in the evidence from an eyewitness is normal. For example, we heard early on some differences in the testimony about what Bridge Guy looked like. Well, those are normal everyday people who are eyewitnesses, and that evidence has just been deemed unreliable across the board for decades.
Right.
But to hear this person who's an expert in her field delivering such information in a way that's so incohesive and hard to follow, I just don't really know what this did for either side.
Right.
But at the end of it all, they are still confessions, and that's really challenging evidence for the defense and really big gains for the state.
Think about what the jury has heard during these 11 days. So if you think back to when these girls were killed 7.5 years ago, so 2017, then Richard Allen a couple of days later calls the tip line saying, hey, I was on the trail, and they brought him in 5 years later. They basically wrote him off in a file saying that Richard Allen's been cleared. Then they discover the file. 5 years later, back in 2022, that's when he's first interviewed. So the jury is hearing and seeing videos of Richard Allen denying anything about this. And then, of course, now these confessions come out after he has been arrested and charged, and now he's in this prison. And as you mentioned, he again is deemed to be, not guilty, presumed innocent. He's in this prison, though, with people who've been convicted, right?
Exactly.
And the worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst. And I think it's really important to highlight, this is not normal. I have handled dozens of homicide cases at this point. I've never had a client kept on pretrial detention in a maximum security prison.
Right.
Now, the circumstance is unusual for Richard Allen because there's a safekeeping order where they have to keep him safe. And so arguably it's for his own safety to be kept here. But the conditions there are unbearable. I would argue that those conditions aren't appropriate for a convicted person.
Right.
Let alone a person who is innocent until proven guilty. We've heard that he was in that particular area for 13 months, over a year. We've heard that the lights are kept on all day. We've heard that he was facing scrutiny and bantering and all kinds of insults from other inmates.
Right.
That is a lot to endure for any person, let alone a person who came in there in a fragile condition to begin with.
Right.
And so I would think that would cause deterioration for anyone. And then, as Emily and Bob noted, he's surrounded by his evidence.
Right, this discovery that they've been talking about, right?
Exactly.
And there's
yes.
maybe some information in there that he's seeing and all that, right?
Exactly, and you have to assume this far into the case, he had been shown photographs by his defense attorneys, because as a defense attorney, you have an obligation to share with your client all of the evidence that they're facing. And we talked a little bit previously about how jurors are processing seeing these crime scene photos.
Gotta be
So
just so hard for them.
So hard for them,
Yeah.
right? And if you are Richard Allen and you truly didn't commit this crime, but you're being confronted with these photographs and being told that you caused this harm to these completely innocent girls and you really didn't do it, it would cause you to start to lose your mind. And so I think the jury has a really hard job of balancing all of that and figuring out the truth.
We're going to be talking more with Katie Jackson Lindsay in a moment, but Bob and Emily want to bring you back in. The defense spent a large part of today attacking the credibility of this prison psychologist, Dr. Walla, right?
Yes, Scott. It wasn't just that they had questions kind of about some of her inconsistent testimony, but they had an opportunity to bring up some of the things that we first heard about in late July when she testified during a pretrial hearing at that point. And there were some bombshells that came out at that point that were hard to believe and hard to imagine, and the jury got to hear those today.
Yeah, we knew, I mean, she testified this summer in those pretrial hearings and today that she was a true crime enthusiast.
Yes.
She told her supervisors that. She said that they were fine with that. And she says today that she told her supervisors that she had an interest in this case even before she started treating Richard Allen, even before he got to Westville. Also, that this is before she treated Richard Allen, visited the bridge.
Yep. Let's pull up a graphic here. I want to show our viewers exactly the things that she told the jury today. During cross-examination, Dr. Walla told the jury, like Emily just mentioned, that she's a huge fan of true crime and she's followed the Delphi case for years. She even visited the crime scene with her boyfriend and said she frequently listens to podcasts and YouTube videos discussing the murders and Richard Allen. And she admitted to the jury that she talked about those videos with Allen while he was her patient and told him what people were saying about him as she is treating him. And she also admitted her fascination with the case led her to improperly access case information about other prison inmates rumored to have possible connections to the Delphi murders, something that is strictly against department rules. So this was again, the defense's effort to highlight some professional lapses and to question really her decision-making and to impeach this witness before the jury.
Yeah, I mean, at one point she testified that she told Richard Allen, look, you have supporters out there online, as I'm reading some of these comments, and we also know that she was recommending to some people online some podcasts that they should listen to, that were the good podcasts to listen to on Delphi, where, you know, I think she talked about one podcast doesn't get too emotional. It's just pretty factual. And so listen to this podcast or that podcast. But we know, and she didn't talk about what information she accessed on those DOC computers today. She didn't go into details, but this summer she certainly did during those pretrial hearings. We know that she accessed the file of a guy named Keegan Klein. And we know from, you know, past investigations and things that, you know, probable cause affidavits that Keegan Klein had actually been talking to Libby German the night before the girls were murdered online and kind of planning to potentially meet her at the bridge the next day. And we also know that law enforcement looked at him as a legitimate suspect initially, and they, you know, a couple years into this, put out a call to us, to the media, and to the public if anybody had contact with a social media profile, Anthony_shots, and that was the social media profile that Keegan Klein was using to meet underage girls online and get them to send him pictures. And so when police looked at Keegan Klein, ultimately he ended up having an alibi for the day of the murders not being in Delphi, but they found all this other stuff on all of his devices, which is why he's in prison now after being convicted by, you know, to lots of possession of child porn. So she was looking up information on Keegan Klein while she's at work on those DOC computers, and she talked about that this summer.
And did you see the jury and how they reacted to some of that testimony?
Actually, I wasn't looking at them. I might have been at that point, you know, so tell me, because I'm curious.
At least one juror, when she was explaining, you know, some of these things and kind of her role, her interest in this case as she was treating Richard Allen in prison, one of the jurors looked, I mean, her her mouth was like, whoa.
Whoa.
I mean, so is there a conflict of interest here? Certainly the defense pointed out that some of the things, accessing the computer, continuing to follow all these things and to share information with Richard Allen about what's being said in the public, it's at a minimum, it's not a good look. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's some professional norms that you don't violate that they brought up that it appeared that she did.
Yeah, I mean, she said she was able to compartmentalize it all, but I think the jury had questions in the end.
Including the question of whether or not she informed her supervisors that she had done all these things, right. And her testimony varied back and forth whether she did or whether she didn't, but we might hear more about that coming up.
And we also learned at one point that she's no longer employed by the third party that the DOC had contracted with that she would work through. So we know that as well.
So testimony then shifted.
Yep.
After Dr. Walla, we heard again from Steve Mullen,
right.
Former Delphi police chief, and his testimony was interesting today. I don't think it was like earth-shattering testimony what he had to say, but why he shared that testimony was super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely speaks to the fact that the jury is, has paid attention and asked some good questions, and the state thinks that they've asked good questions. Earlier in the week, the jury had a question if investigators had looked at the time of the murders at all of the Ford Focuses, 2016 black Ford Focuses that were registered in Carroll County at the time of the murders.
Which is the kind of car.
Which is the kind of car that is on video, the Hoosier Harvest Store video. They say that on that video, that is Richard Allen's 2016 black Ford Focus SE driving, and they've taken still shots of it, right? And in it, you can't see the license plate.
You can't see who's in the car.
You can't see who's in the car. You can't see the marking SE, right? But you see the silhouette that they say resembles that
car
car.
That he said he was driving.
Correct,
that day.
right. So Mullins was back on the stand to answer that question from the jury.
Directly from jurors.
Like he went to the BMV and consulted the BMV and got information about those records in 2016 and 2017 in Carroll County and surrounding counties for the 2016 black Ford Focuses, right? And he found 18 entries of 2016 black Ford Focuses in 2016 and 2017, both in Carroll County and surrounding counties. Then he drilled down a little more. 8 of those black Ford Focuses were SE models. Then he drilled down farther and testifying in Carroll County, only one person had that vehicle at that time, a black Ford Focus SE model registered in their name, Richard Allen.
Interesting. So one of the neat things here in Indiana, the jury in real time can ask questions of witnesses. They write the questions down on a piece of paper. At the end of a witness's testimony, they can pass those pieces of paper to the judge. And as long as those questions are not out of bounds, then the judge asked the witness direct, specific questions from the jurors. It was really neat to see how this played out today, and the fact that not only did they ask a question a few days ago, but the state thought the question was so relevant and important, they wanted to answer it. They did research.
And they did.
And put their witness back on the stand today to answer that question.
And then the defense attacked that, and they said, look, there was other information. Well, first they said, do you track all of the people that drive into Carroll County from all the counties that might be, driving Ford Focuses? Do you track who drives here? And they pointed out in the video that you can't see the SE. Right, on that thing, and that you can't see the license plate, and you can't really see who's driving the thing. They definitely pointed that out. And then Jennifer Auger pointed out from 2011 to 2017, there were other Ford Focus models, not just the SE. There were other Ford Focuses that were similar to that SE model. It got very, very specific, and she brought out another list, 65 black Ford Focuses with similar body types to the SE that were registered in Carroll County and surrounding counties during that time. And then the jury, they came back with another question. I mean, they pay attention, and they really pay attention. And they asked about the rims on the Ford Focus.
That you could see through.
That you can see through. You can see daylight through. Like they've been described as spokes almost, that you can see daylight through these rims. And they wanted to know if there were other models beyond the SE of Ford Focuses that had the option for those kind of rims, to have those kind of rims on those other models. And Mullins didn't know that. He didn't know that, but he did know that those kind of rims were available for that SE model.
It boggles my mind when you think about, again, we've heard from 39 different witnesses so far.
Right.
Each of them sharing all these little tiny details, and you just kind of wonder, what is it going to be? Is it going to be one of those tiny details that's going to stick out in a juror's mind that could either create some type of reasonable doubt, or that is going to convince them that Richard Allen actually committed these crimes? So many details we're
Right.
trying to keep track of.
So many.
Let's pivot now to
Yes.
the last witness of the
Man.
day. And I'm interested to hear you share this story,
Yeah.
because I had ducked out of the courtroom
Right.
to be able to do my live shots for earlier in the day. You got to hear this last witness,
I did.
and you said it was extraordinary testimony.
It was. Well, first I want to bring up a map to kind of orient us, this a map that we've done some markings on so that people can kind of understand. Okay, so we're looking at this map of Delphi near the crime scene. That yellow X is roughly where the crime scene is. And then if you look down and to the right, there's a red circle, and that's where a guy named Brad Weber lives. And if you can see, there's a white line there, that's 625 West. That leads to Brad Weber's house. His house is at the end of a private drive. You can also see in that green area there where the Monon High Bridge is located, where the girls were taken off the bridge on the south end. And then you also see, if you can see, Deer Creek, another white line, it runs under that bridge. And at the top of this drawing, if you can see, the Delphi Cemetery, and that's where investigators came down that day on February 14th and discovered the girls' bodies. They came down through the cemetery to that, approximately to that yellow X.
So
Brad,
again, we were pointing out,
Yes.
is, like, what's important right now is that red, that red circle represents
right, where Brad Weber
where
lives.
Brad Weber lives. The X in yellow right there, that is where the bodies of Abby and Libby were recovered.
Right.
And just where you see where it says Monon High Bridge that we're looking at there, that is the bridge that extends from that spot down closer to that little access road, that driveway, so to speak,
Right.
that Brad would take back and forth to his house.
Right, okay, and the reason why I wanted to show you this, we wanted to show you this, was to kind of orient you to what you're going to hear next. So Brad Weber, the last witness of the day, as we showed you, he lives across the creek from where the girls' bodies were found, lives at the end of that private drive near the bridge. Okay, so he testified, the state brought him in today, and he testified that on the day that the girls went missing, February 13th, he clocked out of work at 2:30 p.m. that day. He works at the Subaru plant, and he clocked out at 2:30, and he drove home, and he said that drive takes about 25 minutes. And Weber says he was driving his van, and they showed him a picture, the state showed him a picture, and said, "Is this your van?" It was a white van. Here's where it got really interesting. On cross-examination, Andrew Baldwin said to Weber, quote, "You did not drive straight home from work on February 13th. And Weber said, "That's not correct." And he was pretty emphatic. And then Baldwin said, quote, "You told law enforcement on February 17th or 18th you went and worked on your ATM machines." And Weber replied, "I said I dropped off a trailer." And Baldwin said, "That was earlier in the day. You went and worked on your ATM machines." And this is the point where Brad Weber shouted in that courtroom, "That is not correct, no." I mean, he shouted it. And Andrew Baldwin then handed him a piece of paper, and everyone was trying to figure out, what is going on? What just happened here? This man is yelling. Baldwin hands him this piece of paper. Turns out it was a subpoena. We didn't see what that subpoena is about, but we assume it's maybe to come back and testify for the defense. The jury was looking stunned. They were all looking at each other. Some people had their mouths kind of hanging open. And we know that Weber is significant for the state because he lives near where the girls' bodies were found. The defense, though, if you remember, has said that Weber's gun, they tested Weber's gun, and the test, to see if it matched that cartridge found at the crime scene, and that the test results were inconclusive. And the defense has brought that up earlier in the week, that those tests were inconclusive. And the defense has also said, and you never searched Brad Weber's property that day. He has some outbuildings behind his property. And the defense made a point of saying that to investigators. And of course, that white van, we know Dr. Walla testified today that when Richard Allen, confessed to these killings, he said that he saw this van right before he was going to rape Abby and Libby. He panicked, took them across the creek, and killed them. So a lot going on here, but it was a moment, I can tell you. And then Brad Weber kind of, he grabbed the paper and he kind of just got out of that courtroom pretty quickly. And then we were all held in. We didn't get out as soon. I think they were kind of waiting for him to get out of there.
He was very agitated.
He was agitated, very.
So we've heard some testy exchanges in court, but for the most part, things fairly respectful. It sounds, Scott, today, some emotions are boiling over, and some witnesses are getting pretty frustrated. And based on the fact that a subpoena has been served, that very well could be for him to return when the state presents his case. So, Scott, we might be seeing this witness again.
And I was trying to figure out, what do you mean working on your ATM machines? What is this? And one of the folks that we share office space with here, one of the Dateline producers, was talking to some residents and kind of digging into that. What is that? And she was told and shared with us that Brad Weber works on ATM machines. He repairs them in town. So that was that explanation on that.
Scott, we're going to send it back to you. We'd love to hear Katie's thoughts on some of those exchanges that took place in court today.
All right, Bob and Emily, we'll get back to you shortly. So let's bring Katie Jackson-Lindsay back in. What do you think about the exchange that Brad Weber and the defense team had about the evidence in talking about his timeline from leaving work back to his house, and this idea of, no, you were with the ATM machines, no, I told you I dropped off a trailer. What do you make of that?
Well, right now it's sort of mysterious and curious, right? I think it's the defense's way of starting to introduce some alternative theories about what happened. We don't know why that's relevant right now, but it's also not their case in chief, and we keep hearing that objection where the state objects to asking questions that are outside of the scope of their direct exam. And so they have to work within these fine lines of the direct exam, and they can't really develop why they're asking those questions. So when we hear that he was handed a piece of paper and stormed out of the courtroom, it most likely was a subpoena to come back during the defense's case in chief. I think it's also pretty powerful evidence for the state, because what we heard was that Mr. Weber was getting accused of something that he didn't do in the context of this heinous murder of these two innocent girls, and he reacted. And that's the state's witness. But the state wants the jury to believe that when Richard Allen reacts in this furious way, when he's accused of something that he's saying he didn't do, that means he must be guilty. And so even though at this moment we cannot tie up why that piece of evidence is relevant, it certainly is significant, just the entire scenario in and of itself.
Okay, the piece of evidence that you're talking about is what?
The piece of evidence is where Brad Weber was, why is that relevant at this moment?
Got it.
We don't know that.
Right.
We don't know the significance of whether he was working on an ATM machine or just on his way home. It's Richard Allen that's on trial, right? So why is that important at this moment? We don't know.
The other thing that was interesting when we heard Bob and Emily describe, this Brad Weber's timing, is the fact that the defense was able to figure out that unspent bullet, the one that had been cycled through a Richard Allen gun that was found at his house, was inconclusive. Did this bullet cartridge actually come from Brad Weber's gun? Isn't that sort of what they were sort of angling there?
Absolutely, and that's super significant, because inconclusive in the world of forensic science, inconclusive means they can't say either way. So they can't say that it did come from Brad Weber's gun, but they certainly can't say that it didn't. And so again, that's reasonable doubt, right? Back to that instruction, if there are two reasonable interpretations of the evidence, you have to go with the one consistent with Richard Allen's innocence. And so now the jury has heard that it's possible that it was Brad Weber's bullet from his gun, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, the state has said, no, we can conclusively tie it to Richard Allen. So those two things don't work well together for the state.
All right, let's get back out to Bob and Emily. We also saw this new motion filed today. Tell us about that.
Yeah, 10 pages, this motion. The accused's second motion to admit evidence of Odinism, Norse paganism, and ritualistic killings. We've known from the beginning that the defense wants to be able to present to the jury an alternate theory that the girls were killed in some kind of ritualistic killing, and they also want to present some third-party suspects, people that they say that police talked to that they believe were involved in this. Now, they've presented a couple motions on this, and those pretrial hearings, they had a expert testify that, yes, she believed that this was a ritualistic killing, that the sticks laid on the girls' bodies were symbols, the marking on the tree, that was a symbol. The judge denied it. Obviously, we haven't heard anything about Odinism so far in this trial, and we haven't seen any third-party suspects. But what this second motion is about today is they say the testimony of witnesses that we've had so far in the past couple weeks, that they've kind of opened a door to them being allowed to present an alternative theory. And here's just a couple quick points that they said that opens the door. We had the pathologist, Dr. Kaur, testify about the autopsies, right? And that testimony involved that the girls were killed with either knives that were serrated instruments or non-serrated, providing the possibility, says the defense, that more than one person could have done this and killed the girls. And also they say that their expert has testified that knives are a part of ritualistic killings and involved with Norse paganism. They also say the prosecution this week admitted photos, or last week, of sticks on the girls' bodies. And they say that they deserve the chance to be able to present an alternative theory as to why those sticks were there, not just concealment, not just an undoing, as Jerry Holman testified. He said that he thought it was either someone was trying to conceal the girls' bodies or it was an undoing. And an undoing, from research and looking into it, is when a killer, kills someone and then they try and undo it in some way and give some kind of respect to the victims. And the defense is saying, look, there was no respect to those victims at the crime scene. So they want a chance to present an alternative theory that those sticks were placed on the girls in symbols. And then the third point they make is that Jerry Holman has testified that only one person is involved, and that in his experience, if more than one person is involved in a crime, usually somebody is talking and saying something to someone. And the defense is saying, look, Jerry Holman knows that investigators throughout this investigation talked to other people who made statements to relatives and such that they have deposed that they were somehow involved in this. So the defense wants a chance to present this alternative theory and to the jury, and we know that the judge has said that, look, and the state has said that will just confuse the jury, that they would hear alternate theories and third-party suspects. Let's deal with this right now. But the defense now saying the testimony that we've had so far opens the door for them to be able to say, no, this is our theory, and here is why, and here are those third-party suspects.
And that alternate theory would be really a main cornerstone of the defense and what they want to offer to the jury. And we should point out that this trial testimony is scheduled for 25 days. Tomorrow is going to be day 12, which would be right around the midpoint. And what we're hearing is the state could rest its case as early as tomorrow. We expect that they might have 1-2 more days of witnesses and testimony at the most.
Right.
Tomorrow, we are expecting to hear what could be, again, even more powerful testimony and evidence against Richard Allen, and that would be confessions made in his own voice, phone calls made to his wife, to his mother that were told, part of these 60 or more confessions that he made while in prison. So we're expecting that testimony to come tomorrow, and after that, then probably going to be wrapping things pretty up pretty quickly and move things over to the defense.
To the defense, then they'll get their chance.
All right, Scott, we are about halfway through what we're expecting for this trial. Another fascinating day of testimony, and we will be back again tomorrow, bright and early. Testimony begins at 9 o'clock Thursday morning, and we will once again be right here in Carroll County. for the Delphi murders trial. We're going to send it back to you.
All right, Bob Siegel, Emily Longneck are doing a great job breaking this down. Since cameras aren't in the court, our reporters are, and we break it down every night here with the Delphi murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock right here on WTHR+. You can also find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial on WTHR.com/Delphi. Thanks for joining us.